Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Search for the 12 Apostles by William Steuart McBirnie, Ph.D. Narrated by James Anderson Foster. We proclaim to you the one who existed from the beginning, whom we have heard and seen. We saw him with our own eyes and touched him with our own hands. He is the word of life. 1 John chapter 1, verse 1. Preface. The High Adventure of Some Kinds of Research. In seeking the information contained in this book, my search for the stories of the 12 apostles took me to many famous libraries, such as those in Jerusalem, Rome, and the British Museum in London. For years, I have borrowed or purchased every book I could find on the subject of the 12 apostles. A 5-foot shelf cannot hold them all. 3 times I have journeyed to the island of Patmos and to the location of the 7 churches of the book of Revelation. One whole and fruitless day was given to a backroads journey into the high snowy mountains of Lebanon, up among the famous cedars and elsewhere, to check out a rumor that St. Jude had originally been buried in some small Lebanese village nearby. He was not. I have personally viewed the many sepulchres which reputedly contain the bones of the 12, not that I consider them as having spiritual value, but because I wanted to learn as an historian how they came to be where they are, hoping that local tradition could be found in the places where the bones are interred that had escaped the history books. This search took me from Germany to Italy to Greece and to almost every Middle Eastern country. The Vatican very graciously granted me special permission to photograph in all the churches in Rome and elsewhere in Italy. Some of the bodies or fragments of the bodies of the apostles are preserved in that historic land. Particularly memorable was the awesome descent far beneath St. Peter's Basilica to photograph the bones of the Apostle Peter where they rest in an ancient Roman pagan cemetery. One simply cannot imagine, without seeing it, so vast and heavy a church building as St. Peter's sitting squarely over a cemetery filled with beautifully preserved family tombs dating back to the 1st century before Christ. 7 times I went to Petra in Jordan, and 3 times to Antioch in Turkey. I also visited Babylon and made 4 journeys to Iran in search of the history of the apostles' missions there. Of course, there were some disappointments. For example, the body of John is today nowhere to be found. I entered his tomb in Ephesus long ago. Recently, after many centuries of neglect, the authorities have sealed it and covered it with a marble floor. Though John's body has disappeared, some parts of the bones of all the other apostles are believed to exist, and I have seen them. Travelers to the Bible lands so often pass within a few yards of genuine relics of the apostles and never know it. I had made 26 journeys to Jerusalem before learning that the head of James the Elder, several arm bones of James the Just, and parts of the skull of John the Baptist were held in veneration in 2 churches there, and, I might add, with some strong historical records as to their authenticity. This is not, however, a book about bones. It is about living people who were described by Paul as the founders of the churches. We are interested in apostolic bones because they are possible clues as to the whereabouts of the ministry and places of martyrdom of the 12. Now, let me face head-on a typically Protestant attitude of skepticism concerning apostolic remains in churches and shrines. I used to suppose that these so-called relics were pious frauds, the result of the fervid and superstitious piety of the Middle Ages. Perhaps some are, but after one approaches the whole question with a skeptical mind and then somewhat reluctantly is forced to admit to the strong possibility of their genuineness, it is an unnerving but moving experience. I suppose the practice of venerating apostolic bones is repugnant to one who, as an evangelical Christian, sees no heavenly merit in praying before the sarcophagi in which they rest. Besides, it does no good to a literal mind to see the gaudy and tasteless trappings which usually festoon the shrines. But the more one reads of the history of the apostles and what became of their relics, and the more steeped one becomes in the history and, strange to us, behavior of our Christian ancestors in the ante-Nicene and post-Nicene eras, the more the careful preservation of apostolic relics seems to be perfectly in character. To many of those who lived in those times who could not read, an apostolic relic was a visual encouragement to faith. Let it be clearly understood, this book is an adventure in scholarship, not dogmatism. I am keenly aware that absolute proof of every detail recorded here is not possible. But when a researcher checks many sources against each other, when he himself visits the places mentioned, and when he finds many new documents that are not in books or not commonly found, then he develops a feel for the probable or possible. This book has been an ever-growing labor of love. I became more emotionally committed to the task as the years progressed. On several occasions during the laborious research, arduous journeys, and interminable writing and rewriting, I have had occasion to compare notes with scholars who have written about some of the apostles, and have found not only a gracious willingness to discuss my conclusions, but to accept some of them instead of those they had hitherto held. How does one express an adequate word of appreciation to the many who were so kind in their cooperation, without whom this study could not have been completed? My secretary, Mrs. Fred Pitzer, made this project her own, and has saved it from worse faults than those it still may have. My students at the California Graduate School of Theology in Glendale have assisted, and quotations from their research appear often. The same is true of Mr. and Mrs. Robert Schonborn and of Dr. Miriam Lamb, who is head of research for our Center of American Studies. Mrs. Florence Stonebreaker, Betty Davids, and Richard Chase assisted, with Italian translations by Mrs. Marie Placido. In Jerusalem, the libraries of the American School of Oriental Research, the Coptic Church, the Patriarchate of the Armenians, Church of St. James, the École Biblique of the Dominicans were most helpful in opening their archives for research. In Rome, the full cooperation of Monsignor Falani opened many otherwise closed doors. How kind they all were, and many others as well. Naturally, any errors are not theirs, but mine. Hopefully, if there are any egregious mistakes, some kind correspondent will write to me so that any future editions may be corrected. A final word about the style of this book. At first, I thought to write it for scholars, tearing apart the documentation of every source quoted. But that makes for so dull a book that I was afraid few would read it. I found to my dismay that most critical scholars could hardly care less about the post-biblical story of the apostles. Then I thought to write it as a narrative, with few quotations and little attention to my sources. But in that case, scholars would ignore the book as having no proper foundation and lacking concern for critical and historical problems. As the senior minister of a busy church, I considered writing for pastors. These ministers might appreciate a homiletical boost for a series of sermons on the apostles that might attract the people we are all trying to persuade to attend the church. I have not abandoned this approach altogether, but I did not do much sermonizing in this book. It even occurred to me that the historical novel might also provide a viable format. But I tend to think as a historian and as a preacher. I lack the imagination to write a novel. Besides, what this book has to offer is analysis, fact, and, hopefully, truth. So the book is in the form of an interpretation or critical analysis of every bit of knowledge I can find on the subject of the 12 apostles. Mostly I wrote it to become more familiar myself with the apostles and to share that knowledge and draw some conclusions from it with as many people as I can. Scholars, church members, young people, historians, ministers, and all those who feel as I do, that we need to find ways to make the apostolic age become more alive for us today. I earnestly hope the listener will find it as interesting and enlightening to hear as I found it to write. William Steuart McBirnie. Introduction. 6 or 5 B.C., Jesus born in Bethlehem. Circa A.D. 5 or 10, the Apostle Paul born. Circa A.D. 26, John the Baptist begins ministry. Jesus' public ministry begins. Circa A.D. 28, John the Baptist executed by Herod Antipas. A.D. 30, Jesus is crucified, rises, ascends to heaven, Pentecost. A.D. 35, Paul converted. A.D. 46, Paul and Barnabas's first missionary journey. A.D. 49 to 51, Paul's second missionary journey. A.D. 53 to 57, Paul's third missionary journey. A.D. 64, Nero persecutes Christians. A.D. 67, Peter and Paul martyred in Rome. A.D. 95, John exiled on Patmos. Circa A.D. 106, John, the last of the original disciples, dies. What follows in this book is that which can be known from an exhaustive and critical study of the biblical, historical, and traditional records of the apostles. The author has tried to reduce the legendary to the probable or likely, justifying it with the known historical facts concerning the state of the world in the first century and the documents of subsequent church history, local history, and relevant secular writings. There is a great deal more information about the apostles available than the casual student might guess. 10 years ago, I produced a monograph called What Became of the 12 Apostles. 10,000 copies were distributed. In that publication, I made the following observations. Someday, a critical scholar needs to take a good look at the mass of legend which has come to us from early medieval times and even from the last days of Roman power. He needs to try to separate the historical germ from the great overgrowth of pure fantasy which one finds in those stories. In a word, a higher criticism of medieval legends needs to be made, and that criticism needs to be carried over into early church history. I find myself disappointed in the writings of recent church historians who seem to pass over the era of the early church and say only what has been said in 100 other books on church history written during the past 4 centuries. It has been so long since I have seen a new fact in a book of church history about the apostolic age and the age of the church fathers that I would be mightily surprised if I saw one. But perhaps someday someone will find the probable basis of truth amidst the legendary, and upon this, with perhaps the discovery of new manuscripts, we shall be able to piece together a better history than we now possess. Since few have done the work of producing a critical study of the 12, it has become a challenge to me to do so, for the sake of a renewed interest in the Apostolic Church. The source of our material in that earlier publication was primarily obtainable by anyone who would take the trouble to look into the standard books on the subject, such as church histories, sermonic literature, encyclopedias, etc., plus the observations of a few journeys to Rome, Athens, and the Holy Land. But that book was frustratingly limited, incomplete, and sorely lacking in original research. I visited the Middle East 27 times, then spent 10 years of further research which shed much light on the lives of the 12 apostles. Most of these insights have come in very small packages, a bit here, a bit there. I had not even considered writing a subsequent book to the former monograph, but the importance and volume of the material I gleaned from my many personal visits to the places of the ministries and deaths of the apostles, plus their burial sites or tombs, has increased my conviction that this enlarged study must be offered. Here in this book, the information concerning the histories of the apostles is gathered. No scholar would dare suggest that anything he has written is the last word on any subject, nor indeed that his writings are the complete story. Yet these ideals have been the goals toward which we have moved. Insights into the Apostolic Age. There are several insights which the listener should have firmly and constantly in mind as the following chapters unfold. The early Christians did not write history as such. Interest in the apostles has waxed and waned in various periods of Christian history. For that reason, at certain times, more information has been available than at others. New discoveries of historical information are made, then lie dormant in out-of-print books until a reawakening of interest at a later time brings them to light. At first, in the Apostolic Age, the apostles themselves and their converts were too busy making history to bother writing it. Hence, their records are fragmentary. Further, until the Ante-Nicene Fathers, history as such was not written at all. Even the book of Acts by Luke was not a general history, but a polemic written to show the emergence of a Gentile Christian movement from its Jewish matrix with divine authority and approval. Surely Luke wanted to defend and validate the ministry of Paul, his mentor. His themes, the acts of the Holy Spirit, the inclusion in God's redemption of the Gentiles, the gradually diminishing role of Jews in the churches, the universality of Christianity, were all the concerns of Luke. It probably did not occur to him that he was writing the prime source of church history. Hence, to a historian of the early church, Luke is both the welcome source of his main knowledge and the cause of his despair at its fragmentary nature. There were periods of silence in early Christian history. After Luke and the other biblical writers, particularly Paul, who left us a considerable knowledge of early apostolic activities, there is silence for a time. It is as if the Christian movement were in a tunnel, active but out of sight for a period. This is not as strange as it may seem. First, the early Christians did not really have a sense of building a movement for the ages. To them, the return of Christ might well be expected during their generation. They certainly spoke of it often, so they must have looked for the return of Christ daily at first. To see this, study carefully the difference in tone between 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. In 1st Thessalonians, Paul seemed to dwell at great length upon the imminence of the second coming. In 2nd Thessalonians, Paul rebukes those who are overeager by reminding his readers of certain events which must precede or accompany the second coming. It was as if he had looked again at the enormous task of world evangelism and had seen that it would take more than one generation. It was not that Paul had lost faith in the second coming, but that he balanced his faith with practicality. In any case, the early Christian movement was in a tunnel and out of sight as far as the recording of history is concerned. They were doing, not writing. The apostles were not considered prime subjects for biography by the early Christians. We look at the 12 apostles as the founders of churches, but to the early Christians, the 12 were considered to be leaders, brothers, and dearly beloved friends at first. It took some time for their spiritual descendants to see them as the fathers of the whole church movement. Their authority at first was in the anointing of the Holy Spirit, not in ex cathedra pronouncements on doctrine. True, the first Council of Apostles in Jerusalem gave authoritarian pronouncements concerning the admittance of the Gentile converts into the Christian movement. Yet this did not seem to have the ecclesiastical authority then that we attach to it now. We could, in fact, wish there had been more such pronouncements, say, concerning heresy, forms of church government, social matters, etc. But there was nothing much that came collectively from the apostles. They simply proclaimed individually what they had heard from Jesus Christ. As they went forth into the various parts of the world, they carried, no doubt, the authority of their apostolate, but they were not the church. They founded congregations which were churches. Ecclesiasticism, in the highly organized and authoritarian forms it later took, was almost unknown to them. The apostles were evangelists and pastors, not ecclesiastics. Their histories, then, are the histories of evangelists, not prelates. History does not deal as much with evangelists as with rulers. Hence, we have little knowledge about their careers before or subsequent to the dispersion of the Jerusalem church in AD 69, by which time most of them had left Jerusalem to go on their various missions, and many had died. Secular history largely ignored Christianity in the early centuries. Almost all history in the first few centuries of the Christian era which has survived is secular, military, or political. Josephus did not pay much attention to Christianity, though he mentions the death of James. Roman history, except for the writings of Pliny the Younger, hardly notices Christianity until long after the Apostolic Age. It remains for churchmen such as Hegesippus and Eusebius to give us further details of the travels and history of the 12. The early Christians were humble folk with some exceptions. Who writes a history of the meek? Therefore, we are left with little information about Christianity in general in secular history, except for valuable insights as to the world in which the apostles lived. The average listener, however, would be amazed at how much knowledge we do have on the history of this period. Roman history is already well known, and more knowledge is daily pouring in from the archaeologists who dig up the artifacts of that great epoch. To the avid student of Roman affairs, the world of the apostles is as familiar as the world of 100 years ago. This does not itself tell us about the actual story of each apostle, but it certainly tells us what was possible or even likely, as well as what was unlikely or impossible. During the Apostolic Age, the Roman world was a relatively safe world in which its citizens traveled widely and often. Read in the book of Romans, written by Paul in Corinth, the many names of people whom he knew in Rome, a city which at that time he had not visited. Read the travels of Cicero 60 years before Christ. Recall the Roman invasions of Britain by Caesar 5 decades before the birth of Jesus and of Claudius in AD 42. The Roman Empire was a family of nations with a common language under the protection of one government, with roads leading everywhere from Britain to Africa, from what is now Russia to France, from India to Spain. Paul himself in the book of Romans expressed a desire to evangelize Spain, which had been conquered by Rome long before Caesar took it over in 44 BC. In the era of the apostles, there was a wide area of civilization awaiting them, civilized, united, and tied together by transportation and tongue. On that vast stage and beyond it, we can easily visualize the far-flung apostolic labors. But Roman historians pretty well ignored Christianity in its early days. The search for the 12 was at first political or ecclesiastical. Long after the Apostolic Age, there arose a conflict between the Greek and Roman divisions of Christianity as to what they called primacy. The Pope claimed it, and so did the leader of the Eastern churches. An issue, for example, was one of Christian art. One group, the Romans, used images in the round, statues, etc., as the objects of religious veneration. The Eastern Greeks preferred icons, images on the flat. There were other differences, including the removal of the capital of the Roman Empire from Rome to Byzantium, but mainly it was a political power struggle which led to the great schism that divided Eastern and Western Christianity, as the Roman Empire itself was divided. At this time, and even before, as the schism was building, both sides sought apostolic identification with their own religious institutions. So a great search was made for the relics of the apostles. Emperor Constantine wanted to construct what he called the Church of the 12 Apostles in Constantinople. In this structure, he intended to house the remains, such as bones or parts of bodies, of the apostles. He succeeded in securing the remains of Andrew and also Luke and Timothy. The latter two, while not of the 12, were close to them. Apparently Constantine felt he must leave the bones of Paul and Peter in Rome, though he may have had designs on the bones of Peter. He gladly built a basilica to honor the bones of Paul in Rome, but one may speculate the Roman Church was also reluctant to part with the bones of Peter. Constantine apparently did not press the matter, but he built a church over Peter's resting place, hoping perhaps to later move his body to Constantinople. In any case, he did not live long enough to collect all the relics of the apostles for his Church of the 12 Apostles. That church building remained unfurnished except for his own tomb. Some evidence exists that he sought to place the apostles' bodies around him in 12 niches, while his own body would lie in the midst as the 13th apostle. Eusebius tells the story in The Last Days of Constantine. All these edifices the emperor consecrated with the desire of perpetuating the memory of the apostles of our Savior before all men. He had, however, another reason for erecting this building, that is, the Church of the Apostles at Constantinople, a reason at first unknown, but which afterward became evident to all. He had, in fact, made a choice of this spot in the prospect of his own death, anticipating with extraordinary fervor of faith that his body would share their title with the apostles themselves, and that he should thus, even after death, become the subject with them of the devotions which should be performed to their honor in this place, and for this reason he bade men assemble for worship there at the altar which he placed in the midst. He accordingly caused 12 coffins to be set up in this church, like sacred pillars in honor and memory of the apostolic band, in the center of which his own was placed, having 6 of theirs on either side of it. Thus, as I said, he had provided with prudent foresight an honorable resting place for his body after death, and, having long before secretly formed this resolution, he now consecrated this church to the apostles, believing that this tribute to their memory would be of no small advantage to his own soul. Nor did God disappoint him of that which he so ardently expected and desired. Planning the Church of the Apostles, Constantine had dreamed of resting there forever in the midst of the 12, not merely one of them, but a symbol of, if not substitute for, their leader. During the months of the church's construction, his agents had been busy in Palestine collecting alleged relics of the apostles and their companions to be laid up in the church with his body, awaiting the general resurrection. Robert M. Grant described Constantine's last days in his book Augustus to Constantine, The Thrust of the Christian Movement into the Roman World. At Easter in AD 337, the emperor dedicated the Church of the Holy Apostles in Constantinople, but soon thereafter he was overcome by a fatal ailment. He visited the baths at Helenopolis in vain, and then proceeded to confess his sins in the Church of the Martyrs. At Ancorona near Nicomedia he prepared his will, leaving the empire to his 3 sons, and in the presence of a group of local bishops he was baptized by the bishop with whom he had fought so often, Eusebius of Nicomedia. To this prelate was entrusted the will, the instructions to deliver it to Constantius, Caesar of the East. Wearing the white robe of a neophyte, Constantine died on Pentecost, May 22nd. Upon Constantius's arrival, the coffin was carried to the Church of the Holy Apostles, and
Sample complete. Ready to continue?